Thank you all for joining me today. My name, as you can see there on the screen, is Robert Barfield. I'm an architect in Charlotte, North Carolina with Gresham Smith in the healthcare studio. I spend about half of my time doing construction administration on large healthcare projects, and I also spend a good amount of my time as a building enclosure commissioning provider, which is of course why I am here today. So I have a bit of a, I think, unenviable position of not only being the 4:30 slot, so I'm standing in front of you all in happy hour, so I'll try to keep that in mind. And also, as I just said, I think I'm an architect presenting to a room of engineers, so that's always an interesting position to be in as well. So as you can see, the title of my presentation is Building Enclosure Fundamentals, Integrating Proper Building Enclosure into the Design Process. And I'll give you a little bit of background or maybe motivation about how this came to be or why I chose this as a topic. And it's because I've done building enclosure commissioning on a variety of projects. I've done building enclosure consulting. Obviously, that's a bit of a different scenario. But it always seemed to me that there wasn't the value out of that process that can really be truly realized if it's done properly and integrated as a part of the entire design process and as part of the entire design team. So that's kind of the motivation for this. A couple of slides that we have to kind of get out of the way here as far as copyrights and credits and so forth. So that's, of course, that slide you can get credit for this presentation, just like all the others that you've been involved with today. Same thing here, just simple copyright information. And with that, we'll go into the course description. I won't bother to read all that. What we're really seeking to do here is understand how building enclosure building enclosure commissioning can be further integrated into the design process and not be kind of a forethought or a purely reactionary sort of service that it often seems to be. So we want to highlight the process which the Building Enclosure Commissioning Authority or consultant can be integrated into the design process, and we're going to hopefully provide some recommendation and advice on how we can possibly enhance that to make it a little bit better than seemingly what it always ends up being in my experience. So I think there's 4 total learning objectives here. I'll read through these pretty quickly. Understand how timely decisions can lead to a better quality assurance process, a greater emphasis on proper building enclosure and less issues during the construction phase. Number 2, how to properly integrate the owner's project requirements into the design process in order to provide successful outcomes and satisfied clients. Number 3, highlight what decisions must be made during each phase of the design in order to deliver a successful project. And lastly, number 4, understand and identify the common mistakes or pitfalls that occur in the design phase that often lead to unintended and costly issues that must be addressed during the construction phase of the project. So just as a matter of kind of understanding who the audience is, I always like to do this. Just maybe by a quick show of hands, any architects in the room besides me? That's what I thought. Thanks for the confirmation. Engineers, I'm sure there's many of those. Anybody that is maybe not an architect but does do building enclosure commissioning? Oh, well, that's great. That's way better than I thought, actually, based upon the people that I talked with so far in the conference. Great. So owners, possibly. I doubt that's probably the case. Oh, that's great. Thank you. Wow, I do have more of a diverse audience than I anticipated. So just wanted to kind of understand who we're talking about and or who we're talking with. That's always a good thing to as we go through the process. So everyone is sort of familiar with this network, this framework that we all operate in. You have architects, engineers, you have owners, you have contractors, you have AHJs, product reps. All of architects and engineers have various consultants that they work with throughout the entire process of the design. And of course, the contractor has all of his subcontractors and even subcontractors. And so it's this huge network of people that are all involved in what is often a long year, or I should say multi-year process. And it is a challenge even without commissioning to deal in this environment. And of course, you can also play into this with different delivery methods. What I do often is a GMP, so that has a different sort of bent to it. You have IPD, that's also a bit of a different scenario that we work in sometimes as well. But nonetheless, we're adding commissioning into this. And I think MEP commissioning, and my Gresham Smith colleagues there in the back can attest to this. MEP commissioning is something that I think is fairly well integrated or seemingly always part of the process. Building enclosure commissioning, although it's been around a while, seems to always be, to me, something that I would say often gets cut out of the process, and even when it is in the process, it often is either implemented not to the fullest extent that I think it can be, or it's implemented often too late as well. So we want to really understand how the commissioning provider for building enclosure can possibly be integrated more into the design team and more into the overall process of the project. So building enclosure, and I have to admit, I was really surprised that all you guys raised your hand and said you do building enclosure commissioning, so forgive me for maybe being a little too simple for you here, but I wanted to just kind of establish a baseline of everything that we're talking about when we're talking about building enclosure. So physical separator of exterior to the exterior environment from the interior environment consists of roof, walls, windows, fenestration, doors, slab, on grade, etc. And of course, most importantly, protects the occupants and maintains comfort. So building enclosure is risky. These are big projects that we're all involved in. They're complex projects. This is a project that I'm involved in that's in Ohio. It is a very large manufacturing facility that I am doing building enclosure commissioning on. And we all sort of wish they were like this, but they are never like this. This one is pretty straightforward. As you can see, it's about 3 million square feet of a pretty big box. So if they were all that simple, maybe we wouldn't be here today, but that's never really what we're dealing with. We're always dealing with complex geometries. We're dealing with different materials that go together in complex ways. So some of those risk factors that I just kind of alluded to a little bit there is greater emphasis on high performance requirements for buildings, whether that be thermal, air, or vapor. And of course, we can throw into that different things as well with LEED for buildings that we might be dealing with. As I just mentioned, complex geometries that result in risky details that are not necessarily standard. We also have new and untested materials that are often used on buildings that have never been used before, or at least don't have maybe the track record that we would like for them to have. And so all these things play into that process. And even as we get into construction, unfortunately, although I work with some really great contractors, and I'm sure all you do as well, they suffer from many of the same challenges that we suffer from in terms of not having a labor force that is sufficient, or not having a labor force that is really trained to do many of the things that we're asking them to do. So we sort of mix all this together, and it's a risky proposition, not only in the design phase, which we're kind of focused on today, but also even into construction. So as you might have realized already, this presentation maybe is a little different than some of the others that you've set in today, just based upon some of the titles that I read. Most presentations here are very technical. This one probably isn't so technical. This is about process, and it's about process improvement. So that's really what I'm advocating for. I think that building enclosure commissioning is incredibly important and valuable to projects, and I think we can do a better job at integrating it into the overall project. So this is kind of the typical design phase. Anybody that's been through a large project in that process understands all of these. As far as what we're talking about today, like I said, we're really talking about the design phase of it. So that's here where we're really doing site analysis. We're setting those client goals, program requirements, and budgets in the pre-design phase. And even into the design phase, we're orienting the building. We're talking about massing, fenestration patterns, coordination with building systems, envelope selection systems, and typical sections and details. And at the same time, we have this commissioning process. And so we're really talking about trying to integrate those two processes together and make them a bit more seamless than they seem to often be, at least as it relates to building enclosure commissioning. So for that purpose, we're kind of talking about here again, where you see some similar type of nomenclature for these types of things versus what we just saw on the previous slide, where we're developing the OPR, we're understanding the project approach, we're doing contract scoping, we're doing the BOD review, we're writing CX specifications, CX design review, commissioning plan, and witnessing factory testing if that's applicable. That's really more probably on an MEP side of things, but that is part of the process. So a couple of, well, more than a couple actually, of my observations that I just sort of jotted down, put together my thoughts as to why I, again, was kind of motivated to do this presentation, and some things that I thought were really good to address and evaluate is building enclosure commissioning providers often provide feedback that is not aligned with the development of the project. So what do I mean by that? And I'll be as brief as possible so we can move on and see some things like that later on in other slides. There always seems to be a response from building enclosure commissioning providers that are, I think, sometimes a little obvious, or not necessarily aligned with, again, the development of the project. I think that there is a higher and better use of their time when that project is in that early stage of development, whether it be design development, even schematic design. And so that's kind of the point of that statement. Building enclosure commissioning providers often struggle to become a part of an effective design team, and therefore struggle to truly provide leadership in the building enclosure design process. And again, I think this is sort of related to number one that I just mentioned. I think that too often, and I've been in this situation before too, whether I was the building enclosure commissioning provider or whether I was the architect of record, it always seemed to be that I was either on the outside looking in, or I thought that building enclosure commissioning provider was kind of on the outside looking in. And I've always tried to get that person to be more integrated into the process, and I've had, I would say, limited success in that regard. Building enclosure commissioning providers are often involved too late in the design process and the overall project schedule. And I bet everybody in here that does building enclosure commissioning can probably raise their hand on this one. We've all been asked to do building enclosure commissioning, and we say, okay, great, when is the project started? And they say, the construction documents are done, right? We've all been there. And that really is not our fault, right? That's kind of just a matter of education. I think that's a matter, again, where we can work to provide that value, and owners start to understand when that value really is at its highest and best, and we can be involved really when we should be. And let's see, number 4, better planning in the pre-design and early design phase of the project leads to less confusion, reevaluation, and redesign by the project team. So this is kind of exactly what I just said a minute ago. It's that redo over and over again where you're not involved at a time that you should have been, and you're not giving the feedback maybe that you should have been at that phase. And so from an architect's point of view, from an engineer's point of view even for that matter, you're redesigning and reevaluating because you're making decisions on things that you should have made in pre-design or even earlier than that. And lastly, but certainly not least, and I think, again, this is probably the most important point of the 5, is there's rarely a do-over on building enclosure. My friends back there from Gresham Smith that are mechanical engineers and electrical engineers that do all of our MEP commissioning You know, I hear them talk all the time about retro commissioning, or I hear them talk about, oh, the air handling unit wasn't working properly, so we adjusted the controls, right? We don't get that opportunity. If it's not right, it involves destruction. It involves tearing things apart. And so it's even more important in that regard that we get it right during design and that we don't have those issues that involve those do-overs when it's in construction. And we've all seen kind of this type of graph. I'm sure everyone's familiar with it, but it's always good to kind of illustrate it again, where the cost of all these decisions that we're making are only going up as we're getting further and further and further into the process. And so again, if we have to do it over, if we have to go back, whether it's destructive or not, even for that matter, if it has to be a do-over in design, that's still costing somebody time and energy and money ultimately. So we have to make these decisions when the time is correct so that we don't sort of repeat ourselves throughout this entire design process. So let's talk a little bit about pre-design and schematic design and what I think should be focused on during those phases of the project. And I will say as well that I don't want to necessarily say that I'm trying to reinvent the process here. I'm really just trying to add to the process. I mean, we all are familiar with NIBS guidelines and ASHRAE guidelines and even LEED guidelines if you're doing a LEED project. So we're not trying to circumvent or do it differently than they are or than that process is prescribed, but we are trying to add to the process a little bit so that we're, again, getting the value out of it that we hopefully can get. So I think that the focus of the building enclosure commissioning provider should be on, during pre-design and schematic design, should be on defining expectations, helping set project goals, and establishing a clear quality control process. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean by that. So when we're defining expectations, we're talking about really what are the owner's expectations of the project, what are the other design team members' expectations of the project, what are we trying to achieve in terms of our energy goals, in terms of even the aesthetics of the building, all types of things like that, where the building enclosure commissioning provider can provide that high-level feedback that is specific to what they are focused on to an architect that is basically trying to orchestrate an entire project. Setting the project goals, obviously that goes into the OPR and even the BOD, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And I think, again, maybe most importantly here is establishing a clear quality control process. One of the things that is difficult is when you don't understand or don't integrate yourself into the process as a building enclosure commissioning provider. You are reactionary instead of being proactive. So instead of understanding when you need to be involved at certain milestones or intervals of the process, you instead just sort of sit back and wait for the architect to call you and say, hey, I got a set of drawings, I need you to look at these. So I think if you understand that process more and integrate yourself more into the team, then you're not necessarily just going to sort of sit back and wait for that person to give you information. So a couple of things about pre-design and schematic design that are kind of questions or I guess guidelines or goals that I think should really be focused on at that level. I'll read through these very quickly. Understand the overall project goals related to the building enclosure as outlined in the OPR. What is the desired life of the building? How might the site and building orientation have an effect? What are the required or desired R values and U values for the building enclosure assemblies? What are the proposed cladding and fenestration types for the building? What are any issues that might be present as far as material compatibility or interface issues? And how will the project address requirements related to air barriers, vapor barriers, thermal barriers, and weather-resistant barriers. So again, I think when we're asking these questions at a pre-design and a schematic design level, and we're not solely reliant upon that drawing review that is just simply giving feedback on what was provided, we can in many ways act a little bit more like a consultant and really provide that value to the design team that I think really helps that process move along with a huge design team that's focused on so many other things. So that is, I think, what we should be focused on, but instead, what we often get is this. And this really frustrates me. This is a project that is in schematic design. It's got some wall sections and details associated with it that are sort of just very early on in their development. And the building enclosure commissioning provider gives us this comment about providing the roof membrane up and over the top of the parapet. That's a valid comment. That is what they should be doing. That's not everything that we should be doing here, but it seems that that's what we always get. And I don't have any issue with the comment per se, but again, I want them to provide more, because if you're an architect on the project, and this is, of course, when I'm speaking here about this issue, I'm probably speaking more from my architect's point of view than I am from my building enclosure commissioning point of view, is we know that. I'm not saying that that's not important, but architects know that. What I want the provider to give me are those very detailed building enclosure issues that maybe I have a blind spot to. At the same time, do we still have to do this? Yeah, absolutely. This is incredibly valuable, and it has to be done on every project where we're redlining drawings, where we're marking up drawings, where we're providing spreadsheets of all of our comments that we're doing during the design process. This is all incredibly important. What is the issue is that it can't be just that. I think it has to be more than that if we're really going to move building enclosure commissioning to what I feel like is sometimes, often, an afterthought, or starts way too late in the process when the documents are done, to something that is valuable even early on in the very early stages of the project. So let's talk about a little bit about owner project requirements, and obviously what that is. Again, all of you in the room that do this like I do understand these things, but just so we establish a little bit of a baseline as to what we're really talking about. So we, of course, for owner project requirements, we define what the owner wants. It should be created during pre-design. I think usually it is. I think that's usually there in place. Maybe it doesn't get integrated quite as well as it should till later on in the project, but it usually is in place early on. And it often outlines high-level goals and objectives. So that's what it should do. And again, I think going back to building enclosure commissioning and those early phases of the project in pre-design and in schematic design, that's also what I think should be done at that level when we're talking about what we expect to get from the building enclosure commissioning provider and the level of feedback that they can give us. Again, we talked about it a little bit before, those types of material issues, thermal envelope issues, R-value issues, U-value issues, again, things that the architect or the other members of the design team are not as focused on, at least at that early stage of the project. And of course, basis of design, and these two things, as everyone knows, work together, basically hand in hand throughout the entire project. And the basis of design is a direct response to the OPR. Should be created during the schematic design. And again, I think in my experience, usually it is. I don't know of a time that I can think of where it actually was later on or too late in the process when a BOD was established. And of course, the BOD is technically oriented, much more technically oriented than the OPR, and can be in both a written and graphic form. Again, I'll say that this is a point where I think that the building enclosure commissioning provider can provide a real high-level value to the project. Of course, I'm also not saying that it's necessarily their responsibility to create the basis of design. That's really more on the primary design team. But I think that feedback that they give to the basis of design related to many of the things I mentioned before about our values and materials and everything sort of integrating together is really valuable even at this level, and is more valuable than providing some kind of red line drawings on a project that is very early in development. So again, we're supposed to have this sort of relationship between these two documents, and they sort of are living documents in a way. The BOD certainly is probably a more living document than the OPR, but we're supposed to have this sort of back and forth between the two, and they really do relate to each other. But unfortunately, what we often get is something that doesn't necessarily equal. Again, I think that this is an area of focus where the building enclosure commissioning provider can really assist the larger design team in driving this process as it relates to building enclosure, of course, and keeping these two documents so that they are linked together and understanding what is important here, not trying to necessarily get lost in the process, but if you focus on what is your sort of expertise here, I think that the value that you're providing even at this very early stage is more than what you're getting out of just simply doing a drawing review. I don't think it's something that we get into very frequently, at least in my experience. I think, again, this is something where whether you're doing mechanical commissioning, whether you're doing building enclosure commissioning, these two things, these two documents tend to be something that we are just sort of given. Of course, there's more of us that are involved, or that we are, of course, more involved in the development of the OPR, but the BOD, not so much. And again, I'm not saying that we necessarily should be, but I am saying that we should give more feedback on that, more technical feedback than we tend to do. Again, I think we tend to take it at face value and just move on with it from there. So, of course, this is really where it comes into what everyone, I think, knows and understands most about building enclosure commissioning, at least during the design process, where we're really focused today. As I said before, we're really kind of not getting so much into the construction aspects of building enclosure commissioning. But it's really about the details of things and how they go together. And that really is its highest and best when we get to construction document review. And again, that's where most of you that do building enclosure commissioning like I do really kind of earn your keep. That's where I think we are all familiar with how we can get that feedback back to the design team. So this is what I think, again, we have the most experience in doing. So some building enclosure, construction document review goals and objectives that I always like to keep in the back of my mind as I'm going through any set of documents is conduct a thorough and complete technical peer review of the project. Of course, again, that's what we all are very familiar with doing. That's what we get asked to do all the time. It's really our probably most tangible deliverable as part of the process. And so we all are sort of on the same page as far as that's concerned. Review project specifications for adherence to the OPR. Again, I think that we probably do a fairly good job of that. I think it's understood what is needed in that case. I don't think that that's something that I see a lot of that gets missed in any way. Maybe specifications probably are a little bit less than actually drawings, and maybe we could also say that we probably need to go back and reference the OPR sometimes a little better than we do, but I think we all, as a group, do a pretty good job on a project-by-project basis of doing exactly those two things. I think, again, the same is true for number 3, actually. We verify that all issues that were reported during previous phases have been properly addressed and integrated into the project design. That's where we're all familiar with kind of keeping spreadsheets of things, keeping lists of things, and using that as a checklist to really check off that all those issues have been addressed that were pointed out early on in the design process. I will say, however, that, and this goes back to our original points when we were talking about pre-design and schematic design, I think that we can expand upon that. I think that we need to not only kind of keep a list or keep a checklist of everything that we have highlighted as far as drawing review is concerned. I think we also need to keep those same types of checklists or documents to also address all of those pre-design issues that we hopefully have been involved in. Like I said before, with all of those material interface issues, R-value issues, those things get lost in the mix, and they're incredibly important. And we have to keep track of those just like we keep track of all those other things that we list on drawings. I think one of the things, and again, this is where I really want to try to increase our value as much as possible, and any of you in the room that do MEP commissioning are our best allies in this case. I think that there is a lack of understanding, or almost a divorce often between the building enclosure commissioning and the MEP commissioning. Sometimes, as you all know, it's not accepted, and so you don't do building enclosure, or as I said before, building enclosure comes in too late in the process, and so it's difficult to have those two kind of processes for MEP and for building enclosure integrated into each other. But that is where I think, again, we need to do a better job of understanding that there is, of course, a relationship between these two things. And as I said, all of you in the room that do MEP commissioning are really our best advocates, because you're there more frequently early on in the process than we are, and I think you can really advocate for building enclosure commissioning in that sense, understanding that these two things are really linked together. And lastly, we're focusing on the integration of the details, and at this point, hopefully, we have done that process that, again, most of which we're familiar with, and we've even maybe gone above and beyond with some other things that I mentioned before. And at this point in the project, it really is about verification. So we're working on how these things integrate, how these things go together, and understanding any issues that might still exist. Again, that is what most of us are pretty good at, right, from a building enclosure commissioning standpoint. So I thought it would be a good idea, because everyone likes case studies, to do a couple of talks about some case studies that I've been involved in over the years. This is something that I got involved with about 4 years ago, actually when I just joined Gresham. So this is a small building. As you can see, that photo on the left is basically the building in its entirety. It's a military facility in the southwestern United States, and I purposely kept it rather vague other than that. The other thing that I would point out, and it kind of speaks to that integration of MEP and building enclosure that I mentioned before, is that is a really large piece of mechanical equipment for a building that is that size. I'm not a mechanical engineer, and even I can tell that. And so that's important to understand because of the issues that ultimately led us to be involved in this project. And the real point of this case study, I don't know whether building enclosure commissioning was actually done on the project. No one was ever really able to figure that out. But I do know that this is a government facility, and in my experience, all of these types of projects have building enclosure commissioning on them, at least as it relates to the air barrier. Now, of course, this is a concrete block building, so maybe the air barrier is a little difficult to get involved in that case. But again, that typically is what I see, so I suspect that was true here as well. So the important thing to understand about the mechanical system is that it was designed as negative pressure. So we're pulling air out of this building. There was some reasons for that had to do with what this building was being used as. It actually was used as a dog kennel, as a recovery area after they performed surgery on military dogs. So they're pulling air out of the building from an infection control standpoint. Well, that's fine, although maybe not the best idea. And the contractor left on a Friday afternoon and came back on a Monday, and all of the gypsum board that he had hung over the past couple of days was lying on the ground. So the photo you see there is them putting it all back up as I was arriving on site that day. So what's happened here, and again, this is that integration that I spoke about a minute ago. What's happened here is the concrete block and the cold form metal truss go together at that point. Can't really see it all that well. It's maybe not the best image. But the only thing that prevents air and, of course, moisture as well from coming into the building at that point is some kind of brake metal, sheet metal. There's nothing else there. So this system is negative. It's pulling in air, and it's pulling in warm, humid air, and that warm, humid air condensates on gypsum board, and that gypsum board is on the ground. So we went in, evaluated this, wrote a report, told them what our findings were. My friends in the back there that do MEP commissioning were assisting me with this project as well, and ultimately provided our findings to them. This is the type of thing that I think if you understand more about the process earlier in the process and are involved as early as possible, can potentially be avoided. This is something where the two-dimensional details don't illustrate the issue at hand. And is this something, at least in this case, aside from the gypsum board being completely replaced, this is something that is actually relatively easy to fix. There's not a lot of destruction that has to be involved in this case, fortunately, again, aside from the gypsum board on the ground. But this is easy to fix and something that should have been caught during design if that process was followed through correctly. So this is a bit of a different type of case study. As you can see there, I call it too much, too late. This is a recent experience of mine where, again, like many of you that do building enclosure commissioning, get involved with this problematic scenario all the time. The building enclosure commissioning provider was asked to join the project when the documents were completely done. So that in and of itself is an issue, and I think in that case, as I said before, the problem there, the primary problem, is really about education, and that's education of architects, education of owners, education of facilities managers, and those types of people on the value of building enclosure. I think that it's just simply a basic misunderstanding of not understanding or not having a appreciation for all of that process as it leads up to construction documents. It's just that simple. And again, this is where if we as a group start to expand what we're providing above and beyond that kind of typical document review and are really integrated into the design team, that we can start to really show everyone, I think, what the value of building enclosure commissioning is. So back to this case study a little bit. Again, we were completely done with documents. In this case, I was actually on the architectural team. and the building enclosure commissioning provider was given the drawings by the owner, and he provided us with some feedback, 85 total pages of feedback. And I sympathize with this, especially when I wear my building enclosure commissioning hat, because I think at some level they are doing what they need to do. They're doing what they've been asked to do. But I also understand that this is a good illustration of that kind of disjointed process that I've alluded to several times now. This is fine, but what I really want to know from a design standpoint is what's really important here. I can't go back now and address 85 total pages of comments, but what I can do is address really important things that maybe should have been addressed during design, and if we had a commissioning provider on board during design, they would have been, but it's too late to sort of go back and do that now. So this is trying to find kind of the proverbial needle in a haystack. I went through all 85 pages of this document and highlighted what I thought was important and what was maybe not important. But of course it also, or I guess maybe not needed to be addressed at the moment, but it's also a matter of, again, educating the owner on when the building enclosure commissioning provider really needs to be involved in the process and again provides that highest and best value. So this is just kind of an example of, unfortunately, what happens too frequently. Again, all of you that do building enclosure commissioning understand this because you've been involved in it probably more times than you care to remember. But this is an example, again, of what I try to avoid on every case. And even if I did ultimately feel that I needed to do this, I think it's important to almost create a hierarchy of needs or a hierarchy of issues that need to be addressed, because we're never going to get 85 total pages of comments to be addressed in a addenda or a revision to the documents. That's not going to happen. There's no time left to do that. So I think, again, if we really focus on what's important here and highlight those things that are important, there's a much better value to the project. So let's talk about a couple of things about really are tools, I think, about how I measure success or how I choose to go about organizing this information above and beyond what I might just call that kind of typical drawing review where we're giving feedback, red lines on drawings. I try to really take all of that information and organize it and put it into some different formats so that it's valuable to the design team, and it's also valuable to us as a means of keeping track of things. So a couple of ideas here about that. Of course, we're all familiar with doing these. We do them a lot during construction when we're doing testing. We do a good bit of them, I think, during design as well. Maybe not quite so much as we should, but we're all kind of familiar with these checklists, these QA, QC type of checklists that really inform the project above and beyond just simply giving feedback to on drawings and spreadsheets of comments on drawings. So I try to use this all the time as a checklist to really make sure that I'm covering everything and kind of uncovering those blind spots along the way that are overlooked. Even if I'm early on in the process, this is something that I like to use to, if it's not addressed now, at least understand that it will be addressed later or needs to be addressed later and will ultimately be checked off on here. So it's something that I think is a useful tool outside of drawing review, and something that I think is a useful tool not only for the building enclosure commissioning provider, but just the overall design team. And it also, of course, has a life as it transitions from the design process to the construction process. We really take this and can kind of reorganize it or add to it as far as checking these things in construction. Other things, of course, are just spreadsheets and tracking and planning tools where we really get into building out the project for commissioning purposes. And this, again, really does relate to what we're going to do in construction, but what we're also trying to do is tie back what ultimately is going to be needed in construction to what we're doing in design. Again, this is what we're trying to avoid. As I said, when I started out, there aren't really a lot of do-overs in these types of scenarios for building enclosure. It often involves destruction when we have to do things over, or even the best case scenario is that we're doing things over that we didn't want to do over, that's costing time and money. So we're tracking this now because we understand what's going to be needed in the construction phase of the project, and it has that value even during the design phase of the project, really early on in the design phase of projects, pre-design, schematic design, starting to build these types of tables and understand all the processes and parts and pieces that need to be reviewed and go together, I think are very valuable and important. And again, this is not information that we try to sort of keep to ourselves, right? We're trying to integrate ourselves into the design team as much as possible. We are trying to be part of that process and not simply reactionary to a request to provide this or review that or give us some information on this. We want to really be riding along on the team with everyone else. And I think the value of doing that is you can get into some things that I think, to be honest, fall outside of the purview of true building enclosure commissioning, might sort of go into consulting a little bit. But again, this is that value proposition that I'm trying to make here, that we can, as a group, start to do things like this where we really are evaluating what's going on in wall assemblies and in curtain wall assemblies and in roof assemblies, and understand sort of how these decisions that we're making early in the process are affecting these types of things. So we still do everything that we need to do. We're still following all of the processes that we're all familiar with, but we can get into this type of thing. And at the same time, I would say we don't necessarily have to do this ourselves. I think it really is playing a role of advisory. I mean, I think I've done things like this before. Many of you probably have as well. But this is also something that the design team may implement simply based upon our advice, to understand what decisions they're making and how those decisions affect other things in the overall building assembly. So this is something that I like to do a lot. Again, I don't necessarily do it all the time. Sometimes the design team takes it on and it's simply a matter of us giving feedback on it. But I think we can get to a level of doing this type of thing that's kind of above and beyond building enclosure commissioning, frankly, and that, again, is a value to the overall project. So ultimately, as we are integrated into the team and we're not asked to be involved at construction documents, and we are hopefully involved at pre-design, and we are able to move along the entire process and be really an expert or a trusted advisor during the design process for building enclosure. So we're doing all of the things that we need to do as a commissioning provider, but we're also going above and beyond that to really be the expert or the focus of the building enclosure. And hopefully the result of that is a success of a project that's delivered on time, a satisfied owner that understands that he or she is getting a high quality building that has been fully vetted throughout the design process, from building enclosure to systems to everything else that goes into the building. The building is performing as it was designed. We all know, again, how that often seems to not be the case. That speaks again to that sort of destructive aspect that we want to avoid. We're trying to verify that this design works even before it's constructed. And maybe most importantly, the bubble up there on the right-hand side, what I'm really here today to kind of, I think, advocate for is that the building enclosure commissioning provider has really added a high level of value to the design process and simply hasn't just provided reactionary comments to documents that they were provided by the design team. So I think that's really kind of where we're really going, or I want to go with this. So with that, I'll take questions if anybody has them. I ended even just a few minutes earlier than I thought. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate your time. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. My microphone friend is. Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I can.
That's okay.
Here? Yes, you're right, actually. Fortunately, OSHA was not on site that day, so we're good. No, you're fine. Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
So if you go back to your the picture, what did you do to fix the drywall fell down because of condensation? What was the fix on that? I'd like to know.
So to be honest, I don't know because we gave recommendations of what the fix was. So whether it was ultimately implemented or not, we kind of weren't paid to do that, right? But what we did is, and I didn't say this during the case study, but the architect actually did it right. They had insulation shown at that juncture of the concrete block and the cold form metal truss. And so it was not, I'm trying to remember, it was not bad insulation, it was something that was a bit more of a foam insulation, but that's what they did to block the air coming through that joint. But again, I don't know whether they implemented it or not. We just told them what our recommendation was. We kind of didn't stay long enough to see that come to fruition. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Yes, sir. Yeah, so this is simply a analysis of what it's a matter of saying, okay, this build, and like I'll use a kind of for example that maybe might not be 100% applicable to this particular image, but it's a matter of saying, okay, the energy code says that I'm in ASHRAE zone 4A and I've got to have R13 bat insulation plus 7.5 CI for my continuous insulation. But what would happen if we push that all to the outside? So what are we, so instead of doing kind of a scenario where you're saying R13 plus R for the bad insulation plus R7.5 for the continuous insulation, I'm getting to a total R value of 20.5. What if I take all of that 20.5 and push it outside? So I don't have to worry about anything related to thermal breaks for the metal studs. I'm pushing it all outside. So it's that kind of an analysis. Yes, sir. I'll try. It's a work in progress for us, just like it is, I think, a lot of people. To be honest, that case study that I showed is probably the best example of that. I've not been with Gresham for too terribly long, so that's probably the best example. Maybe another example, back to the slide that I showed early on, the kind of rendering of the big box. That really is our first really large project where not only is it MEP commissioning, but it's also building enclosure commissioning. We were not there from the start, but we were better than we usually are in terms of being there early on in the process. And so we've been doing that for about a year now. And in fact, no, I think actually more like 2 years. And in fact, they're doing that, that client is doing that same facility, I think 2 more times that are kind of in the pipeline. So we'll continue to get better at it every time around. But that's probably the best example is that project as far as being fully integrated, having not only us, MEP guys back there as commissioning providers, but also having on-site people that are doing testing as well. Yes, sir. Yeah, I'll try to answer your question. I think maybe the best answer to your question, though, is that was sort of purposely not addressed here. And the reason I say that is because I don't know that we're as good as we want to be. I don't know that we always get it right, but I think from a building enclosure commissioning standpoint, that is better than most. Those types of field tests, that type of construction testing is where we really do see the value of it. I think what I'm really advocating here is about being involved in that process and providing that same value in pre-design and in schematic design, and to your point, sir, that is, I think, probably something that, again, you could say is a good example where you are recommending those tests even at that early stage. Again, we're probably all familiar with getting a specification for a curtain wall system, and it specifies an AMA test, but it's the wrong test completely, right? And so it's usually not a problem. You just sort of say, hey, we need to do this one instead of that one. But if you were involved in pre-design, you probably could have had that right listing in there for that. So again, I think that's kind of the point. Exactly. Exactly. Anybody else? I think I just got a 5-minute warning back there a second ago, so maybe that's good. I got a 2-minute warning now. All right, there you go. All right, well, thanks everyone. We appreciate it. Thank you very much.